Good afternoon, everybody. Happy Thursday. Appreciate you catching my regular update from the Capitol. Again, been a bit of a busy week. I've got 3 or 4 items at the top, and then I'll be happy to take your questions. Haven't voted on this yet, but in the next 45 minutes, we will be voting in the Senate, and I'm afraid this bill will not advance. Legislation put forward by virtually every Democratic senator that says we need to guarantee and put into law the ability to protect IVF activities for people who need that help to start a family. And I would remind folks that the first successful IVF treatment actually took place down at Sentara in Norfolk years ago. Matter of fact, the young woman who was born from that process, Tim Kaine brought to the State of the Union this year. This treatment protocol, which helps families that can't conceive otherwise, has literally allowed millions of Americans over the last 40 plus years to have a family. And unfortunately, we saw earlier this year where Alabama tried to ban this procedure. We've seen as recently as, I believe, yesterday, one of the largest church organizations in America advocate getting rid of IVF. And I just don't think that is appropriate. This is an ongoing assault against women's health care rights. I believe that IVF, which, again, allows folks to have families that can't conceive otherwise. I don't know how anyone could claim they're pro-life, yet be unwilling to support IVF. And this afternoon, at least the Senate will be put on record as those who want to protect this procedure and those who, no matter what they say, are not willing to vote for a law that would protect IVF. This will come on top of legislation we tried last week to try to protect the right to contraception. Again, vast majority of senators say they're for right to contraception, but again, we're unwilling to vote to enshrine that in national law. We do see this procedure. We saw it with the Dobbs decision, overturning the right to an abortion. We've seen it, others say they want to try to move the attack and assault on women's health care to right to contraception. And unfortunately, I think later today we will see that a number of my Republican colleagues won't stand up even for the right for IVF, which allows families to conceive children that otherwise they might not be able to. On a slightly different note, still around women's health care, I was glad to see the Supreme Court unanimously today struck down those who are trying to prohibit mifepristone, what's called the abortion pill. This has been used by countless millions of women across the country for years to terminate an unwanted pregnancy. Again, even though the Supreme Court ruled that drug that has been FDA approved can still be on the market, no one should be under any illusion that the assault on women's health care and reproductive rights is still front and center. We again see the Republican presidential candidate continue to try to have it on all sides on this issue, but I think the vast majority of women and the women across Virginia know that their health care rights are under assault, and those of us, men and women, that support women's health care need to bear that in mind as we go to the polls in terms of federal elections later this year. On a different note, I had a really challenging meeting just yesterday with the Bremer family. These were the parents of Lucia. Lucia, where a law has been named after Lucia. This is a family in Henrico County. Lucia was a 13-year-old a couple years back, somebody who took great pride in actually helping younger girls learn soccer. She was played travel soccer. I saw a video of her, bright, incredibly energetic young woman who was brutally murdered walking home from soccer practice by someone she didn't even know, a teenager who once was arrested. It was shown that he had had a tendency to kind of obsess on social media, to say he wanted to create a school shooting. And the parents of this young man still made firearms available to him. Thank goodness in Virginia we passed Lucia's Law that said that if someone is knowingly a threat to themselves or their community, and if they're a young person and then a parent leaves a firearm available for that knowingly individual who has these kind of mental health issues, that becomes a crime. I think that is appropriate. And Tim Kaine and I built Lucia's Law into our Virginia plan. We have submitted a Virginia plan where we take, I think, the kind of common sense Virginia gun laws that have been put in place, such as only purchase one handgun a month, the ability to have extensive background checks, the ability to have red flag laws, Lucia's Law. We've put that forward for debate at the national level. I'm not sure it's going to go very far because, unfortunately, the United States Congress has not taken many actions, with the exception of a minor action a couple years back, and the scourge of gun violence is still out there. I mean, we saw this week the graduation of those kids from Connecticut of one of the more brutal massacres that took place 15, 18 years ago, or 13 years ago, I believe. And some of the kids that didn't get killed were graduating. Brought us back memories of that one of the worst school shootings in American history. And I think this weekend it will be the 8th anniversary of the Pulse nightclub in Orlando shooting. This is an issue that is not going to go away. I feel people have become immune to it. I just wish that those who feel like we need no additional restrictions, I wish they could have sat with Lucia's parents and her brothers the way I did yesterday and explain why something as simple as saying if someone is a known threat to themselves or to others, that if then a guardian or parent makes a gun available, that parent should pay a price. That should be against the law. And my hope is if we can ever get our federal legislation to the floor of the Senate, we will advocate for that. On another item, a little more good news is we all can remember last year when my office and many others were literally overwhelmed with complaints about getting passports. As I'd laid out, we'd seen the passport office personnel cut back dramatically under President Trump. Then we had, with COVID, a lot of people not traveling, passports expired, and people were really frantic about getting passports. Things have improved. It is back down to a 2 to 3 week wait. If you expedite, a 6 to 8 week wait for a passport if it's a new application or a renewal. Later this month, my team and I are going to have a passport fair at Northern Virginia Community College in Annandale, and we've gotten great response in terms of people wanting to sign up where they can come to the community college and start that process in perhaps a more user-friendly way. But this is an example of where we stayed on this problem. The problem's gotten fixed, and we are continuing to try to make sure that this service is available in the smoothest, seamless way possible, and I'm really proud of the work my team has done. Why don't I stop there? I know there's a host of other issues. I've not talked about some of the things that are taking place in Ukraine or China, but why don't I turn it over to Laura so we can start getting questions.
Senator, our first question is Mitchell Miller with WTOP. Thank you very much, Senator. Good afternoon. Wanted to ask you a question. Has some political overtones. You mentioned abortion rights. Obviously, Democrats are repeatedly trying to stress this issue. But on the issue of the economy, as you know, polling indicates that remains the top issue for many voters. How would you like the White House to, and other candidates for that matter, Democratic candidates, to address the economy and inflation as the presidential campaign heats up?
Well, I think there was also news that came out, frankly, on a world basis yesterday that the World Bank and others are saying the global economy is actually doing better than expected because the anchor of the global economy is the United States. And the United States recovery, economic recovery, and even inflation rates after COVID is leading all of the rest of the world, leading Europe, leading Japan. So the American economy continues to be very strong. We've seen job growth at record levels. We've seen new business starts, again, at record levels, and disproportionately post-COVID, the number of women-owned businesses is leading the pack. That long-term is a great sign for the economy. We also saw the report to the Federal Reserve, that inflation had ticked down a little bit. And actually, we're starting to see some relief from, in particular, from grocery bills. And we have seen, again, gas prices cut a bit. I know those are statistics that maybe folks don't feel as strongly. I think one of the things that's driving the economy or driving inflation the highest at this point is rent increases and housing costs. And I strongly urge the Federal Reserve, who I think has done a pretty good job of managing the economy in terms of money supply and interest rates coming out of COVID, but it's time for the Federal Reserve to go ahead and cut interest rates. 40% of inflation is measured around housing and rental costs. And, in terms of direct relief for that first-time home buyer, you cut interest rates at the Fed level, that will immediately translate down into mortgage rate decreases, and I think will open up the housing market a great deal. I know the Fed's trying to be cautious, but I think the pretty good news that came out yesterday in terms of inflation. I think I met last night with some of the country's leading business leaders. The Business Roundtable was in town, and they uniformly were saying that some of the actions that we've taken in Congress, such as the IRA, which has put a dramatic amount of new investment in terms of cleaner energy, or the infrastructure bill, which I was proud to be one of the key negotiators on, which is building out broadband and starting to make investments back in our roads and bridges, airports, rail, that they are seeing a tremendous growth. Now, again, those statistics, what I hope the administration will continue to do is trumpet those new job announcements and announcements of activity that's taking place. We're actually in Virginia up for a couple of tech hubs that I hope that will be successful on. But I do think there are things, some of the things the president has done on student debt relief, some of the things the president is trying to do in terms of lowering and trying to mitigate a little bit of the housing cost increase. We need to do more on the housing supply issue. But in terms of inflation, nothing will have as direct an effect, an immediate effect, particularly in the housing market, than if the Federal Reserve in either July or September cuts interest rates. I think that time is now. You go back to the data, and the data doesn't put food on your table, but we are doing so much better than the rest of the world. And you look at job growth, you look at women business growth, you look at the business leaders who, this was a pretty conservative group, but virtually none of them had any complaints about where the economy is headed. I do think there is kind of a bit of a funk that folks are in. Some of that is probably due to the kind of the tenor of the political debate this year, and that translates into an unease about the economy. I'm not sure, with the kind of some of the shrill political commentary, sometimes on both sides, that kind of tenor of frustration, though, at least on the political language side, is going to tamp down over what the next 140 odd days that we've got until the election.
Senator, our next question is
very
Hannah
much.
Brandt with Nexstar. Hannah?
Hi, Senator Warner. Thanks for taking my question. I wanted to ask you about what's going on with Israel right now in terms of this ceasefire deal on the table, Netanyahu scheduled to come visit you guys in Congress next month, and just kind of support for Israel wavering out there in Congress. I mean, what do you think of all that happening?
I can't think of an issue that has kind of torn apart Americans with such emotion as the Israel-Gaza conflict. Obviously, Hamas, a terrorist group, started this, but there's been enormous suffering of the Palestinians in Gaza, 36,000 plus that have died, and we need a ceasefire. I believe at this point, and I have been intimately involved as chairman of the Intelligence Committee in supporting the CIA director, Bill Burns, who's been the American representative in these negotiations. And while there was a period where I think the Israeli government was a little bit slow to respond, I can tell you right now, the only reason there's not a deal is because Hamas has not accepted the terms that, frankly, Egypt, Jordan, all the other Arab nations in the world support. And matter of fact, that has been endorsed unanimously by the UN Security Council. So I think it is time for Hamas to stop and Israel to stop the violence. But it all now relies on Hamas accepting these deal terms that the negotiators have indicated that they were willing to accept. So it's time for them to stop trying to drag out these negotiations. Let's have that ceasefire, bring the hostages home, and start a process of rebuilding in Gaza where the Palestinians have a life where they can predict with some level of future economic benefits, and that's going to require, candidly, significant investment from other Arab states in the region who, again, I've been in deep conversations with. I think they will do their part, some of the Gulf states, but they're not going to do it until there's a ceasefire. So the time to act is now. Hamas should take the deal.
Senator, our next question is Rachel Tillepaugh with WSET. Rachel? Okay, we're going to move on to Garrett Whitten with CBS 19.
Hi, Senator. Thanks for taking our questions. I just wanted to ask you a question about the Russian ships, warships down in Cuba. As chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee, what can you share or say about the presence of these ships in Cuba? What are your thoughts? What are your personal thoughts on their presence, and is it worrying you?
Well, again, I'm concerned about Russian activity anywhere in the northern southern hemisphere or the in the Caribbean, or my understanding is some of these ships may do a port call in the other ally of Russia in the region, Venezuela. There have been port calls by Russian vessels in the past, so I don't think this is that extraordinary. But I am following this very, very closely and have been following it for some time. At the same time, I'm still remain very supportive of what the president and the other G7 leaders are doing in Italy right now, where they are taking and putting forward a $50 billion loan to Ukraine, and that money is coming from Russian assets that are in the West. This is interest on the $300 billion plus of Russian assets. And I think we need to continue to send a strong signal that civilized democracies around the world will stand up against Putin's aggression. I can tell you, it took way too long. I think it is a complete was a complete mistake that the House literally sat on the supplemental assistance package to aid for Ukraine and aid for, frankly, humanitarian relief in Gaza, or aid to Israel, aid to try to make sure that we can stand up against China's aggressive actions towards Taiwan. Took way too long, but thank God those arms are now getting to the front in Ukraine, and the Russian activities, particularly in the north near Kharkiv, which is Ukraine's second largest city, that is stabilized. What we've seen is the Ukrainians have the will to fight. They have been remarkably successful against an opponent that is exponentially larger. They have the arms and the armament to fight, which now is flowing. They can protect their nation. But we should not back down, but I am obviously monitoring very, very carefully any Russian military activities in our hemisphere. But I would point out this is not the first time that Russian ships have paid a port call in Cuba.
WJLA.
Hi, Senator. It's a pleasure to be here. So I wanted to ask, so in December, you wrote a letter to the GSA to pause the FBI headquarter relocation to Maryland. Now, House Republicans are pushing forward a budget that would allocate funding to only a D.C.-based location, either the current one or a new one in the district. If this were to make it to the Senate, would you support it? And if not, what would be your justification?
Listen, I think the FBI needs a new headquarters. I mean, it's an embarrassment. For anybody who's been to the Hoover Building in the last few years, the front line of our national law enforcement, the FBI, works in unsafe working conditions. You've literally got parts of the building that is crumbling and is a safety hazard. I do think, we went through a process where, they looked at sites in D.C., they looked at sites in Maryland, they looked at sites in Virginia. And the remarkable thing was the professionals, both GSA and FBI professionals, who did the career officials who did the review, unanimously picked Virginia. And as the FBI director himself said, who doesn't weigh in on these things, sometimes pretty fishy about a political appointee coming in at the 11th hour and overruling that. And that's why we asked for the Inspector General review. If there's nothing there, and the Inspector General says there was no funny business, well, so be it. But we need to have that report ported out. I've not followed what the House has done. I do know this, that there are some in the Republican Party in the House, particularly on the Judiciary Committee, which has got some of the most MAGA members in the whole House of Representatives, who seem to be on a warpath against the FBI. So I've not looked at the amendment that says D.C. only. End of the day, the FBI men and women who help protect our country deserve a headquarters that is not a safety hazard. And where that facility ought to be built ought to be based not on politics, ought to be based on what is in the best interest of the FBI.
Senator, our next question is Angela Jones with the Hampton Roads Messenger.
Hello, Senator Warner. Thank you for taking my question. I had a question about the IVF bill. And while this bill addresses a woman's right to seek assistance in starting a pregnancy, maternal mortality is still an issue in the United States, maybe higher than any high-income country in the world. And I was wondering if maybe since the Omnibus Act it's been introduced, but it hasn't been passed, that maybe this bill should include some type of language addressing maternal mortality.
You were right. While actually maternal mortality rates are actually getting a little bit better, we still are an outlier amongst other industrial nations in the world. And disproportionately, it is women of color who have a much higher incidence of maternal mortality challenges. So I do support additional assistance for pregnant women to get the assistance they need. What we wanted to do in this piece of legislation was simply limit it to IVF because IVF is under assault, as we've seen by the Alabama law, as we saw just this week by one of the larger Christian Protestant denominations urging the outlawing of IVF. It seems crazy to me that somebody who says they're pro-life and wants to promote families are then in the same breath not willing to say then we ought to install into national law the ability for those families that can't conceive otherwise to use IVF techniques. I just don't get why in 20 minutes the vast majority of my Republican colleagues are going to vote against that. But maternal mortality is something we need additional resources for as well.
Our final question is Amy Knowles with the Virginia Dogwood.
Hey, Senator Warner, thanks for taking our questions. We've been talking to some of the movers and shakers of summer feeding programs here in Virginia, and I know that you've been a big proponent of getting kids the things that they need to succeed. I wondered if you could talk a little about why these summer feeding programs are important and what the federal government is doing to ensure not only that they continue, but that they flourish.
Yeah, Amy, great question. And we kind of saw the value of this during COVID. When, again, there was bipartisan support that says those same, feeding programs we have during the school year, because too many kids, both in terms of free or reduced lunch, or for that matter, free or reduced breakfast, too many kids don't get a breakfast or don't get a lunch. And how can a child be able to learn? And so many families, when school year ends, their need to have a breakfast or a lunch doesn't disappear. So these summer feeding programs are critically important. I think they need to be expanded. It's one of the reasons. It is part of the solution. The other part of the solution is we had this is one where the House did something and the Senate hasn't. 350 House members voted for a reinstatement of the R&D tax credit, but also bringing back part of the child tax credit. Child tax credit cut, childhood poverty by 40% when we had it in during COVID. We need to bring that back so families have got the ability to afford to buy food. We also need. I've been a big advocate as well on trying to prevent food deserts, because not only do we need to make sure kids eat, but if they're just eating junk food. That means they may not be going hungry, but it doesn't mean they're getting the kind of nutrition they need to be able to grow up healthy. I would also add on this the issue around food banks. One of the things that I have been supportive of back to my time at the Virginia Healthcare Foundation, and what I've tried to do through some of my personal philanthropy is, there are so many communities. People are so supportive across Virginia of our food banks, and I think if most people realized, we've seen, I think in the Southampton Roads Food Bank, they had close to 35% of the families in Hampton Roads had to turn to a food bank at least once over the last year. And those numbers are so much higher than I think most Virginians realize. So we need the summer food programs, we need the child tax credit, we need to deal with the food desert issue, and as that kind of ultimate backstop, we've got to continue to support. And the food banks do such a great job. There are so many churches and other organizations that contribute to them. I've worked in some of those and volunteered in some of those food banks. It's the best kind of Virginians helping Virginians around. So, Amy, thanks for, as always, letting me take a question that's a little bit uplifting at the end of this session. So, thanks again, everybody. Have a great and hopefully this will be still a cool weekend. I know we've had pretty great weather, but unfortunately, I appear that heat wave that's heading east may hit us next week. So. Let's enjoy the next couple days. Thanks again.